Good morning, everyone, and thanks for the kind invitation, Philippe and Sophie. It's really a great pleasure to have this opportunity. And actually, speaking about a few research lines that we have been conducting in the lab in the few past years. And well, actually, the departing point, I think that from the title, it was already very, very clear that in our lab, we are kind of obsessed by networks. So every time we see an object, we try to understand it as a network. And here, of course, we are talking about the brain. And, the brain is actually a network. It's having complex interconnected systems of different regions of the brain. Here are depicted as nodes with different colors depending on the spatial position. And then you have connections between those nodes. Those connections might be anatomical connections or functional interactions that you might infer from neuroimaging data. So our perspective with respect to this is really to try to understand the topological organization of that system. So like making a sort of abstraction and really try to derive which are the organizational principles of these systems as a mathematical object that is very well known in physics and mathematics as a graph. So a graph really is a collection of nodes and connections, and what you will see in the next slide is some methods, some models that would allow us to extract some information about the organizational principles of how that network has been formed, or how these network properties might change depending on a specific cognitive or motor task, or depending on a specific pathology. So just to make a very quick history in the field, now the field of complex networks or network science, I would say it start to date almost 20 years, and there are a lot of literature in the field, and actually it's a science that allows you to understand and model different interconnected systems, not only the brain, everything that is connected, like social systems, infrastructure networks, materials. A lot of important results have been actually derived deploying this network science vision of the field. And really, the basic idea is to try to summarize and extract some properties from the networks that might inform us on a specific property. Like, for example, here is just a very simple example, but you make an abstraction. You have your real networks and you basically transform it in this abstract mathematical object, a graph, which can be nicely represented as an adjacency matrix. So here, this is a square matrix, same number of rows, same number of columns, and the number is actually equal to the number of nodes in the system. And you have a 1, which is black here, when you have a direct connections between two nodes. So this adjacency matrix is what is used for calculations with all the software. But the good news is that from this object, you can extract really simple but informative information. Like, for example, the node degree K, which is the number of connections that every node has in the system. So here I'm associating the color and the size of the node to the most important, the most central node in the graph, which actually corresponds to the most connected one. You can also have other metrics that you can derive from systems, like the very well-known network efficiency, which is actually the average, is the inverse of the average shortest path between all the nodes. And of course, the higher is the efficiency, then the shorter is the path length between all the nodes, and the more efficient is the information traveling across all the system. And on the other way around, you have the network clustering, which instead allows you to have and calculate the tendency of the networks to form highly connected clusters. So I'm not entering and giving too many details about the way they are computed. Here, the goal is just to give you some ideas of how and what we can do with those metrics. And of course, I think that the whole story started with these two seminal papers that appears around 2000 in Natural Science, and actually that used exactly the metrics that I've shown you in the previous slides to derive two important results. On the one hand, the tendency of the real systems to exhibit so-called scale-free properties. So that is to say the presence of hubs in the systems that naturally emerge as a result of a local preferential attachment rule. And on the other end, you have the very well-known, I would say, famous small world phenomena that actually it tells you that real systems also tend to exhibit and to be tend to be not completely regular, neither not completely random, but something in the middle. And this can be actually achieved by simply starting from a lattice configuration, a very regular configuration that you see on your left, by rewiring a few links, and this small percentage of rewiring actually allow you to increase the network efficiency significantly. So by only rewiring a small percentage of those links, you are able to capture this property of the systems. And just for information, for you to know, if you're not familiar with these two properties, the scale-free and the small world properties are really important for either both the structure and the dynamics of the system. So they have been demonstrated to have a strong impact on the synchronization of the systems, on the propagation of information, and so on. So everything started from here, and in the last 20 years, this concept has been really developed with much more sophisticated techniques and tools and applied in neuroscience. And actually, there are many ways you can think in which these methods have been used in neuroscience. Actually, applied, since it is an abstraction of the problem, you can actually use it to model and analyze brain networks at different temporal, spatial, and topological scales. I'm not giving you again the details, but the literature is nowadays very, very vast, and it's being called network neuroscience. Okay, so I think we are now going to enter a little bit on more in detail on what we have been doing in the last years. And here I would like really to speak about how we can use network models to really represent and generate the dynamics of a network evolution. What I mean by that? Well, in general, when I talk about dynamics, I'm not talking about dynamics on network here, but I'm really talking about the network dynamics, to say how the networks changes over time, reassign the connections between the nodes. So here, really, the dynamics is not on the signal or the activity of a node, is on the way the different connections change, fluctuate over time. And here you have a very simple example where the number of nodes can increase. New edges, new connections might appear, others can disappear. So how can we model, how can we think about these time-varying objects? What we have in the literature so far is that that has been done so far is try to derive a sort of master equation in which the rate at which each existing node I acquire new connections that you see here by the letter Ki is somewhat proportional to a benefit cost functional. The benefit here is typically proportional to the number of connections that the node already has. So it's a sort of a richer get richer phenomena. And also, the cost here is typically intended, if we think about brain networks and more in general about spatial networks, that is to say, networks whose nodes have let's say, a real physical spatial position. What they also do is try to penalize this acquisition of new connections by taking into account the spatial distance that is associated, yes, really to the length of the connection that they have been acquired. Also, what a systems would like to maximize is to maximize the number of connections, but try to have an effect that those connections are not too long, because having a long connections means a lot of energy to build it. If you think about the brain, a lot of metabolic costs. And actually, these models work pretty well because they, for example, have been used to model the development of the C. elegans network. Here, you have an example on your right. So the C. elegans network is a worm containing more or less 300 neurons. And you can see that by using this kind of models, you can nicely reproduce either the node degree distribution and the length of the connection distribution. So in this sense, they work really, really well. But there is a drawback because those models are very, very specific. So they are entirely based on the preferential attachment rule. So then a node will acquire more links if already it has many connections. And has been used only to reproduce the adult stage of the C. elegans. So you don't really reproduce the entire developmental trajectory of the brain. So having this kind of questions in mind, we started thinking about how we could derive a more general principle in order to have a more flexible approach that would allow us to address this question is in a more general way. And we started thinking about this with a PhD student of mine that now is at the École Normale Supérieure, and we happened to think about this nice creature, which is a mold actually, which doesn't have any brain, but it looks to be very, very efficient and intelligent in solving this problem, which is trying to find the food in these maze. And I'm pretty sure you already have seen many times this kind of simulations. But this mold is actually able, after a certain time, to reach the food and reinforce the configurations and the connections that allows him to get fed. Now, thinking about these dynamics, this phenomenon, we say, well, why don't taking inspiration from this kind of very, very general principle in which actually the mold is exploring randomly the landscape and at the same time is exploiting the science towards the food in a way to maximize the biological function it is looking for. That translated in terms of a graph or in networks would mean let's try to model the probability of observing a graph G, a network G, as a function of two concepts, exploration on one side and exploitation on the other side. And you can see you can derive the dynamics of the systems based on these two-term equation. So now the equation is not really very precise. I will give more detail in the next slides, but that was the idea. And of course, there is a lot in common about other kind of similar phenomena like evolutionary dynamics, where the exploration actually corresponds to the random mutations of the genes, while the exploitation is really implemented, corresponds to the natural selection process. So you can see how general this exploitation paradigm is, as it is also contains the evolution, which is a specific instance of this possibly general framework. Okay, let me go and give more details about how we can write down in terms of equation this model. So you can see the probability of observing the network basically depends on two terms. The first term is actually corresponds to a random generation of networks. So every time the network is changed randomly, the connections are changed randomly. And on the other hand, you have in blue another parameter, another term, which corresponds to the maximization of a biological function f. This model has two parameters, mi and phi. So mi is the exploration rate. The higher is mi, the more random will be the exploration of the network. And phi instead is the exploitation rate. So by tuning these two parameters, you actually can come up with one single parameter that we call the functional pressure, which is the ratio between the exploitation and exploration rate. And by playing with these two parameters, you can actually reproduce a vast dynamics of networks. Now, these equations, depending on the value that you give to f, might be very, very easy to solve analytically. So we demonstrated you might have closed-form solutions for these network dynamics, but in general, the f might be much more complicated. So you cannot solve it analytically, and the way you do it is using algorithms based on population genetics. So everything is written and detailed in the paper, but I won't have the time to give you more detail here. As for the choice that we wanted to do, because we wanted really to model dynamic brain networks, we decided to use and to assign to f these the sum of these two terms, xgwvd and xgwvesp. So these are very strange, fancy names, but I can tell you that they correspond respectively to the tendency of the networks to form hubs and to the tendency of the networks to form clusters. So these are mathematical forms that are very easy to calculate and that you can easily integrate in the master equation you can see on the top of the slides. Now, what did we do with this model? Actually, in 2021, there was this beautiful data set that came up on networks that was really representing the brain development of the C. elegans at different stages. So that was a really nice data set because differently from the previous one, we don't only have the adult stage, but also we have the previous stages. So what we did, we really wanted to reproduce the dynamics of the network generation, of the network formation of the worm. And to do so, we only fixed the parameters raw, taking information from the adult stage. Of course, we could have done many simulations and tried to find the optimal parameter combinations, but we decided to use this information directly from the adult stage of the worm. And what we found is actually that by using this information, we were able to reproduce and track down the entire brain development trajectory. Here you can see it in this plot, where on X, you have the tendency to form hubs, and on Y-axis, you have the tendency to form clusters. The colors corresponds to the time, so lighter color corresponds to the initial developmental stage, blue colors corresponds towards the adult stage of the worm. The real data corresponds to the circles, so you can see in this topological space where the real data are positioned, and you can see that our model fitted with the optimal raw is actually able to reproduce the entire trajectory, not only the adult stage, but really the entire trajectory. And you can also see what happens if you try to derive a null hypothesis by putting rho artificially equal to 0. You can see that this way is not able to give you any good fit with the data. Okay, so that was just a first result we had in the team I wanted to share with you. And of course, the model is very, very flexible, and you can think about using it for any kind of questions you might have, not only for questions that are related to the micro scale dynamics of the connectons, but also large scale dynamics. And thinking about connectons, so far what I have been showed you is a connecton, a network, where the connections corresponds to synapses, basically synaptic connections. And the connection is really a physical quantity, a physical measures, the connection is there. But more in general, in the field of network neuroscience, you can have also what they call functional brain networks. So functional brain networks are kind of interesting because the connections there do not correspond to physical quantities, but rather to an estimation of some statistical dependencies between the activities that are generated in different regions of the brain. And here you have a very schematic pipeline that shows you how you can construct functional brain networks from neuroimaging data. So basically, you have some modeling choices to do. Who are the nodes? And that basically depends on the neuroimaging technique you are using it. Once you get and you acquire the signal, how you can estimate the functional connections. You can use correlation metric measurements or causality measurements. There are many in the market, but in the end, you can actually come up with a graph and networks that you can threshold or not, extract some metrics and use these metrics to quantify organizational differences between different tasks or different kind of populations, let's say healthy or diseased patients. So our idea at the time was to try to use the functional brain networks in order to improve brain-computer interfaces. So let me give you a few words about brain-computer interfaces for those who are not familiar with. I will talk specifically about non-invasive brain-computer interfaces. That is to say, the brain activity that is recorded will be done by not putting electrodes or things inside the brain, but rather all the sensors are outside the head of the human subject. But the general idea is that actually brain-computer interfaces represent a means for people to interact with the external world by simply modulating their brain activity. That in principle means that people don't necessarily need to move. For example, if they want to control a robotic arm or an external devices, they can just think about something, and the brain-computer interfaces and the algorithm behind will be smart enough to try to classify and recognize the mental intention of the person. How this happens in practice? Well, all this is based on important neurophysiological results that have been discovered around 2000 from the Austrian group of Professor Fuscheller. And basically, they discovered that when you perform a mental imagery of the hand closure, for example, the hand grasping and the grasping, you generate a cortical signature that is very, very similar to that you would have when you realize the movement for real. So this, of course, opened the way to a great impact if you think about all the disabled people who cannot move at all, like, for example, people that are surviving stroke or that had a spinal cord injury. That was at that time a very revolutionary, because really that could represent really a means for those people to keep interacting with the external world. And here I'm just showing an example that we did last year. Here the subject is actually wearing, is a sort of hybrid BCI, is wearing some eye tracker, and with the gaze, the subject deliberately decide to pick one or the other candidates in front of the table. And the robot will position itself close to the can that he has pointed, and then he has to perform the motor imagery, the hand grasping, to let and say to the robotic arm really to pick up the can and grab it. So you can see how it works. When it's red, we are asking the person to perform the motor imagery task. And if it is successful, the algorithms recognize it and instruct the robotic arm to take. They can bring it up and then put it back. This is just an example to show you how you can use this kind of systems. Now, what is the problem of these systems? Why you cannot see those systems in your daily life? Why you cannot see them in the hospital? Well, that is because the so-called BCI inefficiency problem. BCI inefficiency problem means that there is a probability that if I ask you to come at ICM and try to use the BCI, actually you won't succeed very, very, very often. Indeed, there is you will probably be something like here in the middle. That is to say, if I ask you to control the BCI 10 times, you will probably succeed to do it 6 over or 7 times over 10, which is not bad. But we have to remind that, for example, in this very simple scenario, there is 2 class scenarios, the random choice is 50, 100. So, 50. So 5 over 10. So being able to control it have an accuracy of 60 or 70% is not that great. And this is also even worse if you think that patients might use this technology, so they really have to be 100% sure of the things of being able to use the system. So there is a high variability in how people are able to use this BCI. Some people are really, really bad, almost random choice level, but some people are very, very good, almost 100%. We call them the chosen ones, just to make a parallel with Matrix. Now the point and the questions for us is how can we make all those people try to reach a high accuracy level? How can they really use those systems in a way that is efficient for their daily life? Now, let me come back about the neurophysiological mechanism that is so far has been used to control this BCI. This phenomenon is called the event-related desynchronization, a phenomenon that is very well established and consolidated across different species. And it works like that. When you are in a resting state situation, your brain activity actually presents those peaks that you see in this blue curve. So on x-axis, you have the frequency of the signal. The power of the signal is on y-axis. You see that your brain naturally peaks at 10 and 20 hertz. Now, what happens when you perform the motor imagery of the hand? You have a suppression of those peaks. So this suppression is called event-related desynchronization. Why? Because it is actually being demonstrated that it is the result of a local desynchronization of the neurons that are beneath the electrodes that is recording the activity. And this local desynchronization makes actually that the sum of all the spike is not synchronized anymore, and you have, as a result, a suppression of this dominating rhythm. So this is the mechanism that is being used to control BCI. But as you can see, performance is not that great. So our questions, given all those pieces in the table, was at the time, well, is there maybe something else related to the way that specific regions of the brain is interacting with the other regions of the brain that maybe can help us in improving the accuracy of the systems? So what I'm talking about is why not looking at how the same region of the brain is communicating with the other regions of the brain instead of simply looking at what is going on inside that brain, that specific region. And this is actually what we did. I'm not giving you all the detail, but actually we found that when we perform a motor imagery task, you do have a local desynchronization of the signal, but at the same time, the same regions establish significant long-range connectivity with other regions of the brain. And you can actually use this information to improve the accuracy, the BCI accuracy, as shown here in the diagram. Of course, for some people, there is no actually benefit. So At the moment, it's not perfect yet, but we do have some sign that would suggest and indicate that you can do much more to use connectivity and brain networks to improve BCI accuracy and have better communications with the machine. Of course, you can also use this kind of brain, network neuroscience methods to address other kind of questions. For example, before, if you remember the video I showed you before, where there is the robotic arm approaching the can, then the subject has to perform the motor imagery. At that time, we didn't know how to experimentally design the systems. So should motor imagery be performed before the robot was moving? That is what I show here in strategy 1. Or should the subject perform motor imagery during the robot reaching phase? That would be strategy 2. Or should the subject wait the robotic arm, get very close to the can, and then at that moment perform the motor imagery task? Now, what is the difference between these these three strategy is what we call is the duration between the mental actions and the causal effect that is observed by the subject. So in strategy 1, the temporal distance between the mental intentions and the consequent actions is really too big as compared to strategy 3, where instead the mental intention is immediately followed by the action. And this different temporal perception for the subject, which is actually very well known and very well known phenomenon known as intentional binding, is actually promoting and strengthening the connectivity of the subjects, and then the ability of the subject himself or herself to have a better control of the BCI. But also, I didn't tell you before that much of this very low accuracy is a human learning process. So it's, to some extent, is somewhat expected that if I invite you to use these sophisticated systems and ask you, well, why don't you perform a simple motor imagery? So first things you say is, well, what the hell is actually asking you? What does it mean to perform a motor imagery? Should I visualize the movement? Should I rather feel the movement? You actually don't know what to do. And that is because you have to learn to do it. So it's a learning problem. And we actually showed that by using this network neuroscience approach, that actually, in average, people do learn. If you let them play with the systems, it takes something like 2 weeks to improve their BCI accuracy, their ability to control the systems. And this learning process is actually reflected by a progressive disconnections of the frontal areas of the brain, which are, you can see these are the regions in red here in this picture, especially the anterior cingulate cortex. So we do have a sort of a fade out phenomenon that to us was really reminding a lot of the very well-known automaticity processes that you typically have when you learn anything. And last, of course, you can use this network neuroscience approach to quantify and measure how a disease is impacting the organization of the system. Here we just show how a stroke was actually changing the organization of the interactions between the different regions of the brain. On the left, you have an healthy situation where the connectivity is almost entirely contralateral to the movement, as one would expect normally. But when performing the motor imagery with the affected hand, you can see that the pattern is not clear anymore. You don't have lateralization. Everything is much more random, and there is an increased number of interhemispheric connectivity. Everything resulted, it can be quantified numerically by a significant decrease of the network clustering. And what you might want to do is to use this kind of information to have an objective measurement of how possible neuromotor rehabilitation strategies might, based on neurofeedback, might improve the stroke recovery. This is actually one of the objectives of the consolidator grant that I received, as Philip said, a few years ago. We recently received the ethical approval. So to those who know what I'm talking about, they know how much is a pain. But finally, we start the experiment, longitudinal experiment of stroke patients since January. Okay, I think that in the last minutes that I have, I would like really to tell you a story that I'm really excited about, because it's a really recent. It's about something that we discovered and we started to think about with a PhD student of mine that is now a postdoc in Italy, in the Magda Domenico group. And at the time, we were actually thinking about networks. Well, how can we derive new theoretical ways of studying and thinking about those networks? And actually, we came up with this concept of duality. Now, duality might mean a lot of things, right? So every time I see this picture, I find a new type of duality, new form of duality. Because actually duality is really a widespread concept. You have duality in religions, psychology, but I would say that the most, the most maybe concrete, tangible duality that you all are thinking about is duality in physics. That is to say, the quality or state of having two different or opposite parts of elements, and you have many forms of duality: voltage, current, time frequency, and wave particle duality, of course, are also a very well-known example. Now, what was striking for us is that this duality, if you really think about it, it's actually a way to see the same system from multiple views. So let's say we have this object, and actually having a duality means being able to have a different perspective of a same phenomenon, of the same systems. What I'm saying is that the system itself doesn't know that it's dual. It doesn't care to be dual. Dual is something that we, as humans, we care a lot. And why is like that? My guess is that because by having a dual vision of the systems, we actually understand better the systems itself. Now, to try to be a little bit more formal and rigorous, in order to be a dual, in order to talk about duality, well, the primal and dual representation must be symmetrical. They must bring a complementary information, and they should be somewhat interrelated. So these are at least the three minimal requirements that you should demonstrate if you want to speak about duality. Again, our question was, well, what is duality in networks? How can we have a different perspective from which we can study networks? Well, the point is that the way we are used to think about network is the following. So the fundamental unit is the node, okay? So the connections are not a fundamental unit, it's just the way they are exchanging information. So the problem is that having only one fundamental unit or entities is not enough to establish a duality. So we needed something more. And actually, if you think about real networks, real systems, well, the fact of modeling systems with only one type of connectivity is indeed a very rough approximation. Why? Because in general, nodes, neurons, or people can exchange information with different types of connectivity, different types of level. If you think about social network, you know that people can exchange, for example, via telephone, via email, via Twitter, and the patterns shouldn't be necessarily the same. I can be a friend of you in Facebook, for example, but not having sent an email never in my life. So this actually, if you think about then the brain, well, the most striking example is the cross-frequency coupling that you might have in the brain. So you have different regions that might interact at different frequencies, but also across different frequencies. So here the picture is what we call the multi-layer networks, where the nodes correspond to the same entity. but the different layers correspond to different aspects of those entities. In this case, different frequencies, and you can see that connections can be established within layers, within frequencies, between layers, between frequencies, and the picture is much, much more complicated than that. Now, likely enough, in the previous years, there is a bunch of new theoretical tools that have been developed to address and study these multi-layer networks. And here we have an example of two very, very well-written books. But what you have to retain here for the sake of this presentation is that now we have systems that are multi-layer, and we have nodes that are entities and layers that are aspects of entities. So the fundamental unit now is not anymore the node alone, but is the so-called node layer doublet. So why this is important, why this is relevant, or why should we care about it? Well, first of all, let me show you how we can create the dual representation of a multi-layer network. So here is a very simple. I don't know why it's automatically switched the slides, but anyway. So you have a graph here, a very schematic representation, two layers, three nodes. You do have connections within one layer, but also between layers. Now, to create the dual representation of these systems, you simply have to swap the role of the nodes and the layers, and you come up by applying this permutation transformation, you obtain the dual of the network. Now you have two nodes and three layers, and you simply switch the roles of these entities. So that is to say, the local connections, the local interactions keep to be the same, but what is different, and you will see in a second, is how the connectivity is differently observed from the perspective of the node, and this is here, I name it KIX, and from the perspective on the layers. This K is simply the degree, the total degree. You obtain it by simply summing the degree of each node vertically on the left hand and on the right hand. Let me make an example so that everything will become very, very clear. Say that you have this primal representation of the systems, only one connection. Now you calculate the total degree centrality in the primal representation, and you can see that is 1, 1, 0. Why? Because the number of link for the node 1 is 1, node 2 is 1, node 3 has 0 link. I make the sum vertically, and this is what I get, a vector 1, 1, 0. Perfect. What happens into the dual representation? I can do the same. Node degree of this node is 1, this other node is 1, so actually I got a vector KAY that tells me that the two layers, the first layer has a degree 2 and the second is 0. There's no connection. Okay, so now what happens if I simply perform a rewiring of that connection? So I simply rewire it. So here is not present anymore. Now the connection is going from this node to this other guy. Now what is interesting is that if you try to characterize the system and recalculate the centrality, the degree of those systems, well, you don't see any changes. It's exactly the same. Now, the degree of node 1 is 1, because we have this central connection here. Degree of node 2, you don't have the connection here, but now it's there. Still, it's 1, and 3 is always 0. So we were puzzled all the time, because here I'm changing the systems. How it is possible that I'm not observing it from the primal node-wide representation? And guess what? That is because it happens in the dual representation. So what does it mean? First, let me say that standard approaches have always focused on those primal representations. So I've studied multi-layer networks only from the perspective of the nodes. These results, very simple toy game, is actually showing us that there might be things happening in the layer-wide representation that bring information that might discriminate specific cognitive or neurophysiological process, and that so far have been totally unappreciated, hidden to our eyes. Now, All this has been demonstrated mathematically in a very rigorous way, so that we perform a lot of simulations. But here, what I really would like to go straight ahead, even for the sake of time, is how you can use it. And here we just took several real networks available from the website. These are networks actually coming from Twitter, for example, social networks, C. elegans, German transport. Here the color is simply coding for the spatial connotation of the systems. So the blue ones are networks that are spatially embedded, while the green one are networks for which the space does not really mean anything. A social network, in a social network, space is not really does not really matter. What I would like really to bring your attention on is that what we did is to compute this centrality. On the x-axis, you have the values for the primal representation, node-wise representation, and on the y-axis, you have the values for the layer-wise dual representation. And what you can see is that this dual representation is actually allowing you to better discriminate the systems that otherwise would be not discriminable at all. For example, here I'm pointing you these these two circle networks. If you would only look at the standard way, that is to say the primal representation, these two networks are actually the same. And this is what has been done so far in the literature. Only if you add and have a look at what is going on in the dual representation, then you realize that they are completely different objects. And they have something different in their structure. And this is actually the main result of this approach. We then go a little further and wanted to try to see what happens if you try to study then cross-frequency networks in Alzheimer's disease. We all know that Alzheimer's disease is one of the main results in terms of networks is that there is a lot of random disconnections between and progressive disconnections as the disease progresses. We wanted to have a look at it from this primal and dual perspective. We estimated the cross-frequency interactions. That was an MEG study. So here inside each block, you see the connectivity at one specific frequency between all the regions. And instead of diagonal elements, connections gives you information about connections that you might have between the same regions, but across different nodes. So this is what we call the supra-adjacency matrix, a very big elements. But inside, actually, graphically, you can see it and visualize it as the example I showed you before. Now, what happens if you look at the centrality, the node degree of Alzheimer's disease patients as compared to a healthy subject in the primal and dual representation? Well, what we saw is that both representations are indeed impacted. So this here in blue, you see some of the regions that are typically impacted by the disease, that is to say that exhibit a decrease of the connectivity, functional connectivity. But that was, instead on the right, you have what you have in terms of frequency. So here you can see that the frequency around the 10 Hertz is completely decreasing and disconnecting from the other frequencies. And this 10 Hertz is very well known for Alzheimer's disease. It's known to be impacted, even if you look at the power spectrum of the signal. But what was surprising is that that if we look at how those metrics correlate with behavior, that is to say, with the mild, the cognitive impairment, let's say, of the patients, only the dual layer-wise representation was able to retrieve a very strong association with the cognitive impairment. And in particular, the more severe were the cognitive impairment, here reflected by the mini-mental state examination that is low, the lower is the higher is the disconnections of the frequency around the 10 Hertz. Okay, I think that with that, I'm almost approaching to the end. I think that I would like first to do a very quick advertisement, because this Friday we will have a nice panel discussion on network neuroscience with people prominent in the field. We will have Danny Bassett from US, Petra Vertes from UK, Linda Dow, Netherlands, and Bratislav Misic from Canada. So it will be 5 p.m. Paris time. If you happen to be around, it will be a virtual event, so you can connect online, but we will address their very hot topics in terms of multi-layer networks, network controllability, and artificial intelligence and network neuroscience. If you are really interested in knowing more, I really suggest you to join us, because it looks really to be a very exciting event. And this is the website where you can have all the information. You just have to register. And I will conclude by this final picture, which is my group at ICM. And I thank you very much for your attention.